And welcome back to K9 Chat Episode 3. I'm your host, Paul the Dog Trainer. Today we're speaking about nutrition. On the line we have Steve, the founder of K9Pro. He is a nationally accredited dog trainer, behaviourist and law enforcement dog trainer. Steve has been working, training and breeding dogs most of his life, as well as studying nutrition and the benefits to dogs. I hope you learned something from today. A diet for the dog is just as important as the training, whether you feed your dog dry food, wet food or a raw diet. I hope you get something from today. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. It's good to have you. I know a lot of my followers and likers on Facebook have been keen to listen to what you have to say about raw diets. And I thought we would be a great opportunity today to speak about raw feeding and why we think it's important and your opinion on things like that. So, Wolf, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself or your experience with raw feeding?
Yeah, sure. As people may or may not know, I own the company K9Pro and Steve Courtney Dog Training. I've been operating that for quite a long time, over 20 years. And I also breed Belgian Malinois under the prefix of Hertzland Malinois. My experience with raw diet started around about 20 years ago when I was looking for probably performance gains in some of the working dogs that I owned and trained, mainly German Shepherds and large breeds like Rottweilers and so on. And realistically, it would be easy to come back and say that I stumbled across some sort of best idea, but I generally wanted to get away from things like skin and coat problems, and perhaps I didn't know whether or not all the things I was feeding him out of a particular bag was the greatest thing for what I was trying to do. And also I didn't have really a lot of choice of the individual ingredients that the manufacturers decide to put in. So if I wanted to increase or decrease proteins or something like that, I'd pretty much powerless to do that unless I changed the whole bag of food by going and buying something else. And as well as that, right back then, there was not too many performance choices. So now there are quite good quality holistic kibbles and other things like that. So the choices are quite varied now versus back then there wasn't as many. So generally I was looking for something a little bit better. And that's why I decided I'm going to give this a go. And of course there was people who would hunt and things like that. And I decided to use some of the, I suppose, the meat that they were killing and those sorts of bits and pieces to start feeding my dogs on. And that's how I more or less got involved in raw feeding. But I've probably spent the past 20 years researching and trying to find out better ways to do it, more information, dispel myths that of course I'd heard, and wondered if there's any truth in some of these sorts of things. And I suppose the research and development carries through to the animals that I own and train, making sure that they're giving me the health, the performance, the appearance, and I suppose the longevity that I want them to have, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I feed my dogs raw diet.
Yep.
I read your book a while back. For those of you who don't know, it's available on K9Pro.com.au under eBooks. It's a raw feeding book, and I love it. And I learn a lot from that. And one of the things that I get asked all the time about raw diets versus dry food and things like that is that my vet told me it was the best food, one that the vet would sell in their shop. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel that veterinary professionals study more the medical side of things and not the nutritional side of things, whereas usually dog behaviourists, dog trainers and dog nutritionists tend to study the feeding diet. What do you feel about that?
Look, I think if I was to say to you, Paul, my vet told me the best way to fix my dog's aggression problem is, you may not let me finish and you might start giving me advice because you'd probably think that the vet wasn't the greatest person to give me advice on behaviour. And because we actually know that they study very little on this in their many years of studying medicine, behaviour science isn't one of the strongest topics in that particular type of course. Well, nutrition probably isn't the same. Now, I haven't had it confirmed or denied, but it's a very strong feeling throughout the community that what they learn on nutrition is highly sponsored by commercial people, commercial diets and manufacture those. So that's another reason that sometimes they can do it. But I don't really think it's that. I tend to think that it's either one of two things. And if I think sort of wisely and nicely about them, I'd say it's not profit driven. It's the fact that they sell it in the store. They probably feed it to their own dog and they've had no problems with it. So they say this is the best one because we've got a brochure on it and the rep come out and told us it was great. And he sounded like a nice guy and sounds knowledgeable. And I think you should feed that too. And of course there are some that it is profit driven. They sell it in the store and they want you to continuously buy it. And if someone comes and says to me, well, why should I go your way and not their way? I go, well, raw feeding's not my way. It's just my choice. And I don't profit a cent if you go down to Woolworths and buy kangaroo and feed it to your dog. Whereas if I was actually selling the product, then there'll be some question about whether or not there's a personal gain in it for me, I guess. So I don't think vets have got the best information on nutrition, but I do think that they're put on the spot a lot to ask questions, and they probably give advice that's not going to do too much harm. And I don't really think there's anything wrong with that, but that isn't probably where I'd find my information on diets.
Yeah, the thing that shines to me about raw feeding with dogs, and it's not so much about the fact that it's raw versus a dry food that you buy in a packet. It's more the fact that you can control what goes in. You know exactly what you're buying, you know what grade of food you're buying, and you can balance that out with the issues that your dog might have. If your dog has a skin condition, you may be able to add certain things to that diet to help with that. If you have a working dog, you could certainly add different balance of food to give them more energy and endurance through the working. If you've got a lap dog, for example, you might feed different amounts in order to look after that sort of type of dog. So the fact that you can have more control is what gives me a thumbs up with raw feeding, as well as it being healthy.
Yeah, look, the freshness is one really interesting component, but you just said something probably just popped straight into my mind right now, which is that my problem, I guess, in one way is that sometimes someone says, I don't want to feed my dog raw because he's already got too much energy. Well, I remember that for a long time when people were trying to grade commercial dog foods in a bag, they were often focused on the protein level of the food. So the problem becomes that we get some dogs come in here sometimes that are pet dogs and they're on like some sort of quite high quality holistic style kibble with a very high protein, and it makes these dogs have really punchy energy for short periods of time. So the problem is when they take a dog out for a walk, he pulls like absolutely crazy for 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 minutes until the owner finds that the dog is unbearable. In reality, we don't really want punchy energy out of even a performance dog. We want something that can go with a bit of endurance. So sometimes the protein level in the dog food is actually too high. And for changing that to a lower protein raw food, you could manage that energy a little bit better, so to speak.
One thing that I read in your book was talking about dry food is all about shelf life and how long it lasts on the shelf. You might go to a shop and it will say it expires in 2014 or 2015, which is still a fair way away, but you don't know how long it's been in the shop, you don't know how long it's been in the factory, and you don't know how long it's been in the processing form. It could have been there for 3 or 4 years. You'd have no idea about that.
Like, it's wickedly convenient, isn't it? Like, I mean, if I could come out and I was a butcher and I said, I'm going to buy a bunch of meat into my shop and it'll last 5 years, there'd be no chance that it would ever go off. I'd surely be able to sell it in that amount of time. So I have to consider what would I actually have to do to food to make it last that long. And that's what I wrote in the book about when Jamie Oliver was talking about McDonald's and their meats and things like that. I'm going, they're washing this in bleach and all sorts of things to be able to get it across the line so they can make it fit for human consumption. My real concern was if people who have lots of rules and regulations will feed this to us and our children, what would they stick in their dog bowls? Pretty much anything.
Yeah, and
so that's a real concern.
Yeah, and if you read the back of the ingredients, it's very blasé about everything. It doesn't really tell you anything. It will say poultry or beef byproducts. You don't exactly know what that is.
Well, I reckon you'll probably find there's 200 to 300 different ingredients in most bags, but you probably got somewhere between 10 and 15 ingredients listed. So the predominant ingredients, we don't even know what they are. And if just one of those was causing an allergic reaction in your dog that was altering his behavior or making his hair fall out or making his skin irritated, you could go through quite a number of different kibbles. And it turns out that stabilizer 147 is causing the problem. Whereas if I just got some chicken and I blanched it to take away a bit of the fat and I grated up some carrot raw and gave it to my dog, it doesn't meet every nutritional need, but I know it probably won't flare the coat. I know it's not going to cause him any problems, and I can come along and start adding little bits and pieces as I go until I find a diet that works for that dog.
It does beg the question, if it lasts that long in a packet, what is it doing in your dog's stomach?
Well, I think that when you're feeding the dog raw, Paul, you might notice that if you go out after an hour, after your dog has dropped the feces, you'll know that it goes dry and white because obviously the moisture evaporates out of it and it looks like it's 3 months old straight away. But if you feed your dog on a commercial diet, you can go out in 3 months and it still looks fresh. So the preservatives are still operating even when it turns to feces. The dog doesn't break that down. You're preserving dog poo basically in your backyard. That's why it's still slushy and messy. Whereas someone could see poo in our training field and go, that looks like it's been there for 2 months, and it could be as little as 2 hours old.
I think it's important to mention during this podcast also is that raw feeding is not the only way. A lot of people have great success feeding dry food. We're not here to say that dry food's bad. We're here to say that with the facts, you can make the choice on what you feed. I know specifically with some dogs that have some conditions, some dry food might actually be helpful to them or beneficial to them if it's a variety that may be prescribed to them. So it's not all about raw feeding is the only way, but certainly with my dogs, it does wonders. I can guarantee that.
Well, when we released that book, as we wanted to say, is it's just like the training philosophies and the methods that I have, and probably that you do. A lot of mine over 20 plus years of training dogs are self-created. And I don't expect the world to line up behind me and come along and say that these are the only way. I don't think that they're necessarily always the best in every circumstance, but I apply them as I think that they're the best. And I have people that I know that have owned dogs for a long time, and they have fed them kibble, still feed them kibble, never change. I don't all of a sudden stop talking to them. I'm not upset if people don't use it. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. But I mentioned I think you once before, that my male German Shepherd, he lived to 4 years ago. He was nearly 18. A female, I lost her only 5 or 6 weeks ago now, and she was heading towards 17 years old. These are German Shepherds. These dogs don't last that long very often. They've been to the vet 1 or 2 times in their whole life for hip x-rays so that they could be bred. They don't get sick. They don't have coat problems. They have really strong performance. Now, I'm known for the performance of these styles of dogs. Their coats look fantastic. Their health does. Their endurance is there. Performance is there. Clarity. They've got everything I want them to have, and I think that nutrition plays a part in this. But there are some commercial diets that, for instance, someone has a coat problem and they get a medicated diet for their dog. I know I can replicate that with raw food, but I know that not everyone can. And if they give it this medicated diet and the dog is doing well on it, there's no reason to change that. You won't benefit a whole bunch, but for especially people that have performance dogs and they're doing agility, fly ball, any type of bite work sports, working dogs, things like that, these dogs are going to notice a huge improvement in performance if they're fed an appropriate diet. That's why I wrote in the book there's a couple of actual recipes that you can just give your dog straight off the recipes that I've put down, including the measurements, or it actually teaches you how the diet works and says, here's a formula for how you can put your own diet together on every day. I think you said before, Paul, you actually enjoy doing it.
Yeah, I really do enjoy every morning, every night. I get the dogs in, and while the dogs are there, I start preparing their meal, and they just basically sit there and lay down and just chill out until it's time. And I get to mix it all together. I get the supplements, which I also get from K9Pro.com.au. Some Animal Naturals supplements. Mix them all together. They love it. It's a really good bonding time with me and my dogs. I use the food ritual, a really good way to bond with my dogs as well. And to be honest, they've never loved food more than the raw diet. They really enjoy it. I find people are asking me possible health risks that their dog might get salmonella or E. coli.
Yep, I think that 99.9% of the time they have been subject to some scaremongering, and someone else has come and said, this is what's going to happen if you do that. And I think that creates so much fear in people. They're not willing to take any risks. And that means they're thinking, of course, emotionally. If they stand back and start thinking about it rationally, they'll realise that wild dogs have lived on these types of diets for a really long time, and they don't die of all these diseases. But there is one potential risk that I've identified, and I say, when people are trying to take less risk, they don't realise they're taking more. What I often find is that, and a lot of the research I've done is, if someone says, look, I don't feed totally raw, I give kibble and I also give some raw mince. And I go, okay. One of the problems is that the kibble being a dry food can absorb some of the hydration fluids in the stomach, so it can grab the suspension that's inside the animal's gut, and it can use this to soften the kibble and break it down. Sometimes there's a risk, and it's only an extremely small one, that this can pick up some of the enzymes, the active enzymes in the dog's stomach, and it can, as it then processes the kibble, these enzymes can be removed. If you're really unlucky and you did that, and a lot of the enzymes were removed from the dog's stomach, and you fired a bunch of raw chicken into your dog's belly, there's probably a tiny little percentage that something could go wrong. But the key message is that if you decide to transfer from commercial kibble to raw, do it in one foul swoop. And when I think of people who say, I don't want to do that, they simply want to use up the amount of kibble they've got left. So I just go, well, just keep feeding it until you do, or sacrifice half a bag. What's the difference? But if you mix the two together, that's the only potential risk that I know, and it's an extremely small percentage of that risk.
I'm really glad you mentioned the mixing, because I had that question earlier that someone said they mix the kibble with the mince because they want the kibble to be good for their teeth, or they mix the kibble with the mince so the dog still gets the nutrients. And that's one point to mention, that they do digest at different rates. And a lot of people humanize dogs to the point where they think like us, and they think they digest like us, and they don't. They are physiologically designed to digest large meals less often, compared to cattle and sheep that can graze all day, which is, I believe, one of the issues with leaving food out for a dog all the time to graze as well, can also cause some digestive issues. Sometimes
you're right. What you might do is that you're leaving food out, and this can attract large amounts of bacteria from the environment, flies and other sorts of bugs. And the other thing it tends to do, obviously, is it slows the dog's metabolism down through grazing. So basically, you can end up with a very picky dog, and it says, look, I'll see what's coming on offer later, but if not, I'll always have this kibble available 24/7. So you can improve a dog's appetite and performance and metabolism by feeding a number of times a day rather than leaving kibble laying around all of the time.
In reference to the kibble for the dog's teeth, that's what I feed raw meaty bones for. That's great for their teeth. How do you feel about raw meaty bones?
They're right, but the problem with kibble is when you're trying to talk about how you clean teeth is that if you ever watch a dog eating kibble, it does that with the back 2/3 of its teeth, when really all of the dog's teeth have a role in playing in dissecting the prey animal that they've caught. So this means that they might use, for instance, their front teeth to take pieces of skin off and tear that away, the large incisor or a canine to be able to puncture holes in there, and the back ones then to grind up pieces of bone and so on. So if you did give the dog kibble and you said, here you go, this will clean your teeth, it'll definitely do nothing for the front, it'll definitely do nothing for the canines and the ones just behind that. And in my experience, I found the back ones aren't clean either, that just the kibble isn't hard enough to be able to polish off the teeth and clean away the tartar and other bits and pieces. But definitely a large bone ratio, because obviously what's going to happen is it's going to develop the jaw properly. So again, if someone's breeding animals and they're talking about conformity, the jaws in the dog will develop more naturally if the dog is chewing up bones, because it's going to develop, like for instance, children who have problems in young age and not speaking very well, because we have a therapy program for children, they make sure that these children are eating meat and solid foods, because they're developing actions with their tongues and their jaws, moving it side to side, which helps them later on form words. And if they're being fed slop or milk and that sort of thing, they don't develop these muscles and this control of their jaw, and sometimes they don't pronounce words properly. If that happens with children, it'll happen with dogs. So you can get overbites and underbites are exacerbated by not eating solid foods they need to chew up. So these things become important as well. But generally, it's very well known amongst the raw feeding community that if you give your dog bones, they'll have much better teeth. Even as puppies, what that'll do is it'll tend to loosen the puppy teeth appropriately, because they're little caps, and those puppy teeth will come out without too much stress. If you don't do, the teething period can be much longer, because they're going to come out on their own, and that's only going to happen by the teeth below growing and pushing them out. So there's lots of reasons why this is the natural diet that dogs were designed to operate on. They are predators. They're supposed to catch animals, kill them, pull them to pieces, and eat the pieces that are appropriate from them, and move on. So to say that any way, in shape or form that this won't be right for them is definitely untrue. And it's just not the only way, but it definitely can't do them any harm.
Yeah, there is a myth that's as old as the hills, and I know my take on this, but I'm curious about your opinion. Won't eating blood make my dog vicious? They'll get the taste of blood.
If only it was that easy. Like, I know a lot of people who train dogs for military and police and protection. If it was simple as giving them a bucket of blood to drink, it would save a whole bunch of time. Not at all, of course. First of all, I don't know how the dog would actually know that there's blood inside another live animal, because we're not using that. I can only assume that it would come back to something that I heard years ago, that when they blood greyhounds, this is when they actually got a rabbit, and they come along and they might, stimulate the greyhound with a live rabbit on top of the cage to create frustration and probably more drive, so it'll chase it harder in the race. But the taste for blood, I absolutely think, it's a really good myth, but it's no more than that.
I would have to agree with you 100%. And one question I've got is, can you make the food in advance and freeze it?
Yeah, of course. Like many people use things like juices and food processors, and some of my early diets included more vegetables. When it was more of like even within the raw food community, there's different diets. There's one called the prey model, which basically is that you sort of build a little animal out of components, which include its stomach sac, its bones, some sort of offal, muscle meat and so on to various ratios, and you give it to the dog. And basically it's like them catching an animal and eating it and moving forward. There's bath diet, which is, what people call it biologically appropriate raw food, which includes more vegetables and other bits and pieces. And there's a lot of different models, but most of them are around the same. But all of these can be frozen and defrosted. Concerns are if we defrost them in things like microwaves and so on, just like with our food, that we can nuke some of the nutrients that's in there. So it works much better to be able to defrost naturally if we want to be able to achieve that. But very many people, once per week, end up with a kitchen table full of a lot of ingredients, and they open up little bags and have a scale there, and they put them all together, and the ones for today and the rest go in the freezer. And every night they take one out, or two out if they're feeding the dog twice a day or 3 times a day or whatever they're doing, and they go through that sort of process over and over and over again.
My listeners will be curious about an average meal that you would feed Venom.
Yep.
What would the average, I know it changes all the time, probably depending on what you need, but what would an average sort of makeup be?
So for instance, say because I want him to have power, he's going to have either lean mince, or roux mince or something like that. And that means, it doesn't mean mince, it can be in the meat form of a steak or something like that. And, like recently, I probably said 2 or 3 months ago, there's a local Aldi store. You probably have those there as well.
Yeah, we do.
Where they were selling human grade premium mince for, I think, like maybe $4 a kilo or something like that. And we bought 100 kilos or something and stick it in. So we use, predominantly that. We know it's clean. We know it's human grade. Has a good amount of fat content in it. He'll get that along with meaty bones. And I aim a lot at the brisket bone, which is like the human equivalent of the sternum, the chest bone. That brisket bone is a soft bone that digests easily and has a high degree of calcium in it. It's great for puppies, great for dogs that you want to make sure that they've got enough calcium to stand their ears if they're German Shepherds or that style of dog. To get some of those, he'll have sardines in his diet. He'll have obviously the supplements that we use, animal natural supplements, which are not a necessity with most dogs. They're usually for improving the performance or the appearance. So if you show your dog and you give it the showstopper, it's almost impossible to replicate the level of coat quality that you'll get unless you use this particular product. If you've got a dog that works quite hard, we give them either super fuel or peak muscle, and this is basically like an athlete supplement that makes the use of their exercise, make sure that they've got recovery period is quite low. They build a lot of muscle from increased duration energy, stuff like that. And older dogs we give them young at heart, which tends to improve their digestion. It's a long topic for which supplements are right, but there's a bit of that sort of stuff in there and on our website. But I'd focus on this one and telling you about old dogs. When we get a dog that's probably 7, 8 or 9, their digestive capacity seems to fall off. And even if you're feeding them a really good quality kibble or a raw diet or whatever else you want, their body's ability to be able to pull that apart and extract all the nutrients out of that starts to become somewhat limited. And they start to look old and they start to act old and they slow down. And from here it's quite a rapid decline. But when we give, like for instance, my Shepherd, when she was probably, I think maybe 14 or so, I started testing out the Young at Heart Animal Natural Supplement on her. I noticed that until then, her eyesight was diminishing. They were slightly glazed over. Her hearing wasn't as good, and her movement wasn't as good as it was probably the year or so before. And I could see aging signs. And I gave her this product, and within probably maybe 5 or 6 weeks, her eyes were back to black pools. Her teeth were cleaner. She had more energy. The training field from our house was probably 100 meters. I started seeing it turning up in the training field when we were turning under dogs. She was physically appearing, looking and acting and seeing as if she was a younger dog. By the only change I've made was add this one supplement. So for older dogs, it's quite imperative to make sure that it's not merely what food you're putting in, but sometimes the supplements improve digestion, and then the dog can make better use of the food that you're paying good money for. So that's why the supplements are added, and that's why we put those in there. But to finish on his diet, he basically is getting high protein things like roux or really good quality beef, brisket to make sure he's got good calcium, and this also cleans his intestines, digestive system, anal sacs and teeth. Supplements, fish, so that could be sardines. Just you don't have to spend a fortune. You can buy them from places like Woolworths in oil, and basically you'll get a can a day for his size of dog. But you can split that can into 2 days for a smaller dog, or one every 3 days if you wanted to. Those sorts of things. I give him a vitamin E gel cap, which I squeeze into his diet, which means I must puncture it. Although you eat them as a human, the digestive system of a dog is different, and it may not break down the actual gel cap, and you might lose that. So I puncture it and squeeze the vitamin E in. And he's on a wild fish oil as well, He works pretty hard, and I don't want him to break, those sorts of things. And then basically has some variances. He could have some lamb heart, some liver, and so on like that. And these are put in pretty small quantities, basically as the ratios that I advise in my book. The beauty of it is that if you come along and you said, for instance, someone come to you and they said, Paul, I need some training on my dog, and you said, no worries, one of the things I might mention to you, sir, is that your dog is quite overweight. And he goes, okay, I'm going to put him on a diet. And a diet to most people means less food. To me, that means less nutrition. The dog will have less energy and will be less happy. He will likely then spawn behaviour. He might start barking or digging or carrying on. And it's back to the situation. If I don't give him more food, he's going to dig holes in my backyard. If I give him more food, he's going to maintain this overweight system that he is. In a raw diet, I could just substitute that with raw carrot. And that means that his belly would be full, he'd be smiling, he'd think he would have enough of that, or have enough nutrition going into him. He wouldn't be hungry, but he'd be losing weight. And that's the beauty of what you said before, is you can change the ingredients up as you like. If I found that I wanted to diet my dog and not leave him hungry and whining and carrying on, then I can start to add vegetables and change the ratio to 50-50. The weight will drop off, but he will still feel full after every meal. If you get really specialised and you said, look, I've got one dog that I take and I run it in agility, I want to feed that dog roux, all of the other components you can still use as the same. You don't have to have several different bags laying around the house that expire at different rates and all those sorts of things. So by building this, you're actually putting the components in that you think will benefit your dog. And you can change these daily, weekly, monthly. So those are the sort of things that start to happen to the point where, like, a lot of dogs actually put on a lot of weight when daylight saving runs out because their owners don't walk and exercise them as much. Well, that might not be a good idea to drop their actual food, 3 cups of kibble back to 2 because they're going to be unhappy as well. But what might happen is that they would get more vegetables in their meal rather than as much meat.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for people listening to this that might not know where to start, it can be quite confusing. I do suggest you head over to www.K9Pro.com.au. There will be a link in the description. Check out the eBOOK, which is Raw Feeding Made Easy.
Yep, that's right.
And all the supplements that you spoke about are also on the website, available to buy. I get my supplements from you, and I also downloaded that book from you as well. And I learned a lot from it, even though I knew a little bit about raw feeding already, but the book sort of highlighted a few things, made it easier for me, gave me some ideas and recipes on food that I may not have thought about. And it sort of distills some of the myths about things, such as on a few websites about dogs, it says that you shouldn't feed them eggs, and eggs are bad for them. And then on other sites, it says you shouldn't feed them raw chicken because of E. coli and salmonella. And a lot of that is just silly because dogs have stomachs completely different to us. While part of the egg might be high in a certain vitamin that is bad for dogs, the other part of the egg is very low. So it balances out and you get a real healthy alternative to a diet.
At the end of my book, it gives you a list of the books that I've read that I thought were helpful, that I got information from if you want more information, and books that I thought that probably were maybe a little bit more complicated for the average read, where I sort of sat with my hand in my head and I don't think that they're necessarily good value. I didn't learn anything from those sorts of things. And basically, the same thing is, if they feel like giving it a try, they should give it a try without any risks at causing health concerns or behaviour problems with their dogs.
And it's really, a lot of people say, where do I buy it from? It sounds complicated, but to be honest, most of it is available from the local supermarket. You can, it's like anything, you shop around to get a good deal. Like you said, at Aldi had a good deal on kangaroo meat that was quite cheap.
Yep.
Safeway sometimes have good deals. I mean, chicken necks are very cheap, but there's some delis and some butchers that give away chicken necks. They don't want them. There's no use to them. So if you look around, you'll find plenty of places that would sell all the things that you need for the diet.
And a good quality pet store, they can go in there now, and if the pet store doesn't look like, basically a fly-rated heaven, there's flies everywhere and the place is filthy and stinks, you can ask for a look at the meat, and if you find that the meat looks fresh, smells fresh and everything like that, a lot of people's only budget option is to buy from those places, and there's nothing wrong with that either. Whereas I also know a lot of people that only feed their dogs organic grown food, and that's still not me. I try to aim for somewhere between pet food and home grade food, but I just make sure that those things are obviously fresh and within date and are going to be helpful. The older it gets, the protein level drops, and I might actually be just feeding content rather than actually any useful nutrition.
With raw feeding, it sounds expensive, but a lot of the food in the diet is actually quite cheap. A lot of the offcuts you can find quite cheap at butchers, Safeway, Coles, all the major places you can buy. If you buy in bulk, it's even better.
When I started off, it was more expensive because I didn't trust the pet food stores a long time ago, and the food was pretty much rubbish, stuff that people had caught and brought in, I guess. and human grade food was just too expensive or not really thought of. But the cost of dry food and bags, like some of the high brand ones, $120, $140, $150 a bag, it's considerably cheaper to feed human grade raw food than it is some of these very expensive kibbles. It really is. So at the end of the day, when people put it together, they go, "Geez, this is costing me less money." And then the other part of it is if they go to Woolies whenever it's markdown time, when they come and say, "Hey, look, the best buy date on this is going to be in 2 or 3 days," and come that afternoon, no one's bought it, they start marking stuff down, and you've got steaks going out at $4.50 a kilo. If someone has an average sized dog, they'll feed this dog for probably around about $20 a week on what I'd call premium ingredients. It's pretty hard to match that in a good quality food. If you're talking about someone who buys, I don't know, Lucky Dog or one of those brands that the cheapest you can buy, like, I mean, they're not interested in the health of the dog anyway, so that might be cheaper to feed it that way. But if you're spending good money on, the Black Hawks, the Ziwi Peaks, the Eukanumas, Science Diets and all of those sorts of things, then you will feed raw cheaper unless you're, especially if you're a thrifty shopper where you go and look for specials and things like that. And you're not stuck on every week it has to be meat. It can be chicken, or you might go like the Aldi and see that this is very cheap, and my wife just grabbed every packet that was there and come out with 40 or 50 kilos and dump it in our freezer. And what happens is then the price per kilo drops right down. It's not expensive at all. And if your dog is dropping weight, increase the protein. If it's putting on weight, increase the vegetables. But it's really not a hard circumstance to play with and make it work exactly as you want it to without compromising the nutrition.
I agree. And I know that especially in Australia, the obesity epidemic for humans is outrageous. And it's coming that way with dogs. I would say about 50 or 60% of dogs that I work with are overweight, and 20 to 30% are grossly overweight to the point where it's actually affecting their health in a really bad way.
Yeah, and I think that generally people are a bit more time poor, so the amount of time they have to exercise their dog and walk it is somewhat less than it was, or maybe ideal. But if you had some way to be able to come along and say, I can't walk you today, but I don't want you to continue to gain weight, here's half a bowl of veggies and half a bowl of meat, at least the dog isn't going to be starving at the end of that, to the bargain. They're going to come and start to say, well, I feel like I've had a good meal, but I notice I'm getting smaller. So it gives you another tool to be able to monitor that. And that's what I'm saying is some dogs, when they're, probably at 14 or 15 or 16 months that I've owned, is that I might bulk them up a little bit so that I can add a little bit more muscle structure later on. So again, I can give them more protein and put a little bit of weight on, turn that into exercise and build more muscle for some of the types of works that I might want to do. But it's completely at your disposal. You can have the dog looking, acting, behaving, and performing as you want with a lot of dietary changes. You don't have to be an expert at all.
Yeah,
so, that's the benefit there.
Often the back of the packet of dry food will, in my experience, will tell you to feed your dog more than you should. So
kibbles tend to, on weight, tend to be in a circumstance where you have to give them more than what probably is ideal per their ratio of mass. So sometimes some dogs need that because of the digestion, and that means that they're basically not harvesting all the nutrition out of their dogs. Like, I know a long time ago when the premium dog foods came to Australia, like Eukanuba was one of them, their catch cry was that what this food will do for your dog is have smaller, less smelly stools. So the premium goal of the food was to have less poo that stunk less. They weren't really focused on telling you about how the dog will work or how healthy it'll be or how long it'll last. They were really talking about how to make it yet more convenient for you. Well, I'll just say one good thing is that a vet that I go to, and if you look her up, her name is Karen Hedberg, and she's extremely well respected all over this country, especially as a German Shepherd vet. I've been in her surgery and she's had a barbecue chicken for lunch and thrown all the bones and the carcasses to her dogs. And even I would go, hey, this is A, chicken, and B, you're cooking it, and it's been cooked over a charcoal. These are splinter and stuff like that. And she goes, haven't had a problem in 25 years. Now, this is how she thinks as a vet, because obviously she could probably go and fish them out, but she's been inside more dogs than I have, clearly. So at the end of the day is even the biggest no-nos have, and she probably had 20 German Shepherds that she would do this, even the biggest no-nos have never caused a problem in her dog. So a lot of these things that we fear and we say we shouldn't do and all the rest of it, like I say, don't feed weight-bearing bones like chicken legs and things like that, because these things have a high degree of flexibility and a high degree of hardness. Again, my dogs have eaten them before I knew this was a problem. I've never had a dog with a blockage in my life. So these things do exist, and they're probably written down for when I write an eBOOK, and I know there's going to be somebody out there that gives them a femur off a cow and the dog will eat the whole thing. So you're trying to be overly cautious, but there's just no risk. If you let a wild dog go, it will catch things. And sometimes if the things to be caught are scarce on the ground, they will eat something that was killed 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 days ago. And someone goes, well, it's not a balanced meal. If you have a wild dog and he lives near a river, his diet will be predominantly fish that have washed up on the shore. If he lives in the bush, he'll never eat fish in his whole life. And the idea is that they all survive. They live a longer life than they do in domestication. So the risks that everyone's running around worried about, they really don't exist. They technically exist, but they don't truly exist.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for joining us today, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It was great.
And that's it for another episode of Canine Chat. Thanks for joining us today. All the links for the appropriate information will be in the description. Join us next week for episode 4.